Thank you, Emily. Well, welcome. Good evening. I need to come down here more often. You know, this really is one of my, I'd say definitely I'm going to qualify that a little bit. My favorite part of the state. I've spent a lot of time down here in southwest Indiana, including right here next door to Jasper. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come here and be with you all this evening and to talk about my favorite part of the state, and that is the South. And that's why we call it Southern Exposure, the land of bluffs, bayous, and barrens, and a little bit more. And I've subtitled it where you can visit several national parks without leaving southern Indiana, because I feel there are a lot of parallels between some places here in southern Indiana with some of our favorite national parks. So let's just check those out. You know, COVID's still around with us, but not like it was a couple of years ago. And many people just weren't traveling anywhere, or at least not any great distances. And yes, you might want to go to Yellowstone or the Everglades, but people just weren't traveling as much. And so you could stay right here in Indiana, however, and see some places that may not be as grand as the falls of the Yellowstone, such as this, but you know we have one, it's in a little more intimate scale at Clifty Falls State Park over in southeast Indiana. Or, yeah, you might have wanted to go to Bryce, but hey, we've got our own rock features here in the state. You might want to go to the Everglades or Big Cypress, or right here near at hand is Twin Swamps Nature Preserve down in Posey County. So we've got it all right here for you in southern Indiana. Let's back up a little bit though and talk about some of the historical aspects of Indiana. And we'll pick the time when there was continental glaciers making its way down across Indiana. Up.
Sorry, I'm shorter than you.
Is that better? Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. That was my wife, Barbara Jean. So we're at the very southern terminus of all the continental glaciations that occurred in North America, but there is a part of it that wasn't. And as you can see, there on that little green finger that sticks up there, that's the unglaciated part of Indiana. And that's where our rugged hill country exists. But you don't have to go to the rugged hill country to see some interesting places. Here's the outline of the early glaciers. This is the one, we'll call it the extent of continental glaciation. Some people, the geologists, say it could be the Illinoisan glacier, or maybe even pre-Illinoisan glaciation, but that's the border of all of the glaciers that ever reached the south end of our continent. And then that one black line above is the Wisconsin glacial border. And so I'm going to be talking about places that are south of that black line, south of the Wisconsin glacial border. Back in the early 80s, I and some contemporaries in my division came up with what we call the natural regions of Indiana. And this is a map that we came up with. And we're going to be looking pretty much south of that line there. And we're going to start in the southeast part of the state. I'm really high grading all of this. There's so many things I'd love to talk about, but there's so little time, right? So let's start in that far eastern part. This is the Clifty Falls Nature Preserve. Well, it's actually called, the nature preserve itself is called Clifty Canyon, which makes up most of the state park. So there is a state law that was enacted in 1967, just called the Nature Preserves Act. And what it does is provide permanent protection, I should say in perpetuity, unless the governor of the state determines that the citizens of Indiana have better use of that property than exists as a nature preserve. That's never happened. Unfortunately, it hasn't, and we hope that it never does, but there are approximately 300 state-dedicated nature preserves. So there is that law level of protection. And they're found all over the state, and they may be embedded within a state park or a state forest, fish and wildlife area, or they may be just owned outright by the Division of Nature Preserve, but they're all state land. And this is one that definitely is an impressive place to visit if you haven't. And I'll point out a few what I think are cool plants of these areas in Clifty Falls, and it just so happens that this one's called the cool wart, right? And I didn't come up with that common name, but you know wart, W-R-T, is just an archaic name for plant, so it doesn't mean anything on one's finger. And it's named Sullivan's cool wart because it's named after one of the early botanists named Sullivan. But this is the plant on the left, and it's a plant that in flower stands maybe 6 to 8 inches in height. But look at the distribution in the yellow that's within all of the green, and you can see that we've just got a little bit of it here in Indiana, and then there's some over in where it's lighter green, means that maybe it's not quite as rare, but in southeast Ohio. Then up in here in what's called the driftless area, which is unglaciated part of the upper Midwest, and then a few other occurrences. So it's a pretty rare plant. I hope you don't mind me talking about plants, but that's kind of my thing. This is another plant that barely gets into Indiana called the Canada lily. And you might think, well, I've seen that around. Well, maybe, but maybe not. Notice how the petals, actually that's a combination of sepals and petals, we'll call tepals, but look at how they just barely flare up. But that's the one that you might most likely see called the Michigan lily. That's probably in just about every county, but that Canada lily is just there in the southeastern part of the state. A nice, really attractive raspberry. Raspberries, you know, most of them are pretty tasty, but this one isn't. It does not produce of any fruit that you'd ever want to eat. They're very dry, but it makes up for that deficiency by producing these very colorful flowers, and it does make an interesting ornamental, but known in Indiana only in the southeastern part of the state, at least naturally occurring. Also in that southeastern part is a big public property called Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge. Some of you folks might remember its previous name, which is the Jefferson Proving Ground. Thank you, Jefferson Proving Grounds, where during World War II there and years since were testing ordnance, but that was stopped, and then most of it became a wildlife refuge. And lo and behold, it's home of quite a number of really interesting and rare plants. This is the environment of much of it. It's a flat woods, and it typically doesn't get flooded by overflow from flooding streams and rivers, but just collects from the direct precipitation. And because it's not maybe tabletop flat, it does have a few shallow depressions that'll collect water, such as this. And this is one of the plants that you might find there, which is found nowhere else in Indiana but on that property. And it's called the climbing fern, American climbing fern, Lygodium palmatum. Called palmatum because it has these finger-like projections with a palm of a hand and the fingers. So it's a vine. Not many ferns are vines. And in Indiana, it's the only fern that has that growth form as a vine. But it's also home to this interesting critter called a crayfish frog, or where I come from, we'd call it a crawdad frog. And they call them that because they live in crayfish burrows. Come out early in the spring, they'll do their calling and mating, and then back in the burrow for the most part. Most of the occurrence in Indiana is a rare frog, are in southwest Indiana, but this is the one population you can find over in southeast Indiana. Now we're going to go into the central part, this is really the core, the heart of the unglaciated part of Indiana. And there are two natural regions that compose most of it. One we call the Highland Rim Natural Region, and the other the Shawnee Hills Natural Region. And that physiography extends on down into Kentucky, makes an arc around, especially the Shawnee Hills, and goes over into southern Illinois, where you also have the Shawnee National Forest. And this is our rugged country. Now, you could have gone to the Smokies, but you don't need to. You could just go to Brown County State Park, or at least some of the other areas of that similar topography, such as Clark State Forest, Jackson, Washington State Forest, Yellowwood State Forest. You know, that real rugged country. And if you were to drive down Interstate 65 south towards Jeffersonville and Clarksville and New Albany, and if you look off to your west, rather, as you're going down the interstate, and you can see those knobs, and we also call those knobstone areas or knobstone escarpments. It looks rather mountainous, at least for Indiana standards. I like this quote from an early traveler that came through Indiana along the Buffalo Trace. You might know that of that. His name was Maximilian. He was from Europe, and he was on his way out to the Great Plains and to the west, went through forests from the East Coast, came through Indiana, and then on westward. And so, you know, he's experienced, you know, he's seen all the Appalachian Mountains, but I love what he says here. We saw the wildest, most picturesque woodland scenes, romantic, rugged valleys filled with tall forest trees. I had never before seen such forests in North America. I think that's a pretty nice tribute to what we have here in Indiana. This is one of our nature preserves in Clark State Forest called Outbrook Ravine Nature Preserve. It's a relatively new state park, but I want you to focus upon these knobs. This is an aerial photograph, and you can see those green areas there. Those are Virginia pine, and this is the area where we have naturally occurring native Virginia pine. You can see some of the forest, but I love range maps. And you can see here where most of the Virginia pine is found, and then here's this little piece up in southeast Indiana. Now, this same pine has been planted around, and it also escapes, and you'll see it in quite a number of landscapes in the hills here in southern Indiana, but this is the area of natural occurrence. And an understory of what we call ericaceous shrubs, those that are in the blueberry family. We've got a species of blueberry in the understory, as well as huckleberry. And this is almost a solid occurrence of both of those. And these are acid-loving plants. So most of the hills are acid in nature. And our only endemic wildflower is what we call Deems foxglove, named after the great early 20th century botanist Charles Deem. Wrote a Flora of Indiana that was published in 1940, and it's still what I consider our Bible of Indiana botany. So it was named after him, and it's known predominantly in those knobs from like New Albany up through, in Floyd County up through Clark County, and just barely into Jackson County. And so it looks a lot like another kind of foxglove that we have, but there's some significant enough differences, at least to the eye of a botanist, that would consider it a separate species. So it occurs nowhere else in the world but Indiana. Sandstone is a major feature, and if you happen to have the opportunity to join some of us I know, which I see in the crowd, on the hike this afternoon at Hemlock Cliffs, a special area in the Hoosier National Forest, you'll see some impressive outcrops of sandstone. And sandstone typically is acidic in nature, and so a lot of acid-loving plants grow there. You can find them growing on big blocks of sandstone that stand out. These are like 2 stories tall, but split apart and create almost little walkways or pathways through them. And of course, here's old Jug Rock. Now that's sandstone. Now you know out in Bryce National Park, they call those hoodoos. And why not us? We can call it, instead of calling it Jug Rock, let's call it Hoodoo Rock or something like that. But anyway, you can see it's just another name for a column or a pinnacle of weathered rock, and it forms these interesting formations. That's in Martin County near the town of Shoals. This is one of the plants, and again you can see it just barely gets into Indiana, is a mountain laurel. If you've traveled down in southeast, especially to the Smokies, you'll see huge, massive areas of this. They also sometimes call them laurel hells. They're so dense and hard to walk through. But beautiful plant, and the flowering plant's a shrub, and another one of those plants that gets barely into Indiana. And we saw some shrubs of this at Hemlock Cliffs today. They just weren't in flower, unfortunately. Various ferns are almost anywhere, depending on your taxonomic treatment. Could be as many as 80 different species of ferns in Indiana. This one's a little rock-loving thing called the lobe spleenwort. And it loves sandstone. I've never seen it grow on anything but sandstone. This one's also in Indiana, a native magnolia. I know you all have seen lots of magnolias in bloom here lately. The star magnolia with its white blossoms, and the saucer magnolia that has more of a pink petaled flower. Those are not native magnolias, but they're commonly cultivated. But this is a native one and has some pretty large leaves. And as far as any of our trees with leaves that big, at least simple leaves, not compound, I would say those are our largest leaves of Indiana. And I think that's where the name umbrella comes in, where they form these almost umbrella-like clusters of leaves. The flowers are pretty sizable, but they are not fragrant. In fact, they're very stinky, unfortunately. But there's the range, again, barely getting into Indiana. This is that Hemlock Cliffs area we were looking at today. Big sandstone overhangs. And named after the tree that's found there and fairly commonly is the eastern hemlock. Not to be confused, that hemlock name, you know there's poison hemlock out there, which is totally unrelated. That's a herbaceous plant and very toxic and weedy and non-native. This is the tree, eastern hemlock. And see the different scattered locales that it's found in Indiana. Probably the largest population's up in Turkey Run and Shade State Park in that area, but we have some nice ones down here in the south as well. Now you could have gone to Mesa Verde National Park, but you didn't need to, because you could have gone here into Indiana, and we've got these rock houses, and they were also occupied by first Americans, and so you can see signs of that where they lived in them. Very interesting. That's where I would go, especially in the wintertime, to get some shelter from those cold north winds that come through. And I think they intentionally picked these rock houses, also called shelter bluffs or sandstone overhangs, that face the south or southeast, perhaps, away from those cold winds. And if you look carefully back in there, you can see a bit of green. And there's only one plant that I know of that could grow back there, and it's this. It's called the Appalachian filmy fern. This, I will admit, is my all-time favorite native fern. It is that individual frond that you see there is maybe 3 inches in length, or a little bit more perhaps in good growing conditions. They call it filmy because the leaf blade is only 1 cell layer thick. It's translucent. If you were to put your hand behind it, you could see your finger. And it grows in Indiana only back in these deep, dark recesses of those sandstone overhangs. And we have about 7 populations in southern Indiana. It's a tropical group of plants. There are several hundred species of filmy ferns, and they're almost all in the tropics. But this is one that's able to tough it out in our temperate climate because it's protected. It's almost like a sheltered greenhouse in a sense, but never gets sunny per se. It's usually always shaded but not too cold or not too hot compared to the outside ambient conditions. And here's a nice growth of it, a big population of filmy fern. When I first started getting interested in botany a long time ago, and I first saw this plant, I really loved the environment in which it grew because it's kind of fun. You got to get on your belly sometimes and crawl back and take a look. And after I saw that, I said, I want to go look for more. And we just called it filmy fern fever. If you get that, you can't pass up a sandstone overhang. Now this is a filmy fern's world eye view. They're back in underneath those and it's dark, and that's the only part of the world that they see is looking out. Of course, they don't move. Another plant that likes those overhangs though, that's a flowering plant, it's called French's shooting star. At one time it was thought to be known only in southern Illinois in this kind of environment, named after a botanist there named French. But we've since discovered that it's elsewhere, including Indiana. But they like to grow in the shade of the overhangs, and you can see here how it virtually stops at the edge of the shade line of that cliff. Now, we have another species of shooting star, which is much more common and statewide, but this is the only one that grows underneath the overhangs. French's shooting star. Now, we also have some limestone, including some impressively large limestone cliffs along the Ohio River. But other than that, most of them are relatively small, but they're basic or neutral or alkaline in pH, so they have a different host of plants. You won't find some of those acid-loving things. You'd find this little fern called the walrue or walrue spleenwort, Splenium rudimeraria. So here's my little reason why it's good to learn a little. Here's the fern, by the way, I should point it out. That's the fern. There's the fertile frond where it has spores, and here is the sterile fronds. And that's actually columbine leaves there, but this is the little fern. It's only a few inches long, grows in the crevices of rock, but it also grows in crevices of limestone brick walls in Europe. And my wife and I were in Ireland, and we found bunches of these things growing on bridge walls and so forth. It's the same species, Splenium rudimeraria. But what I want you we're going to dissect some names here. It's called the wall rue, because it grows on a wall. It looks like the foliage of a herbaceous flowering plant called common rue. You can kind of see the similarities there. And then the ruta muraria looks like the ruta graveolens, which is the Latin name for wall rue. So that even the common name and the Latin name tell you something about that plant. It's a rare plant in Indiana. You don't have to go to Mammoth Cave National Park. You can stay right here in Indiana and go to Spring Mill State Park, and there's an impressive cave there called Donaldson's Cave, and it's in Donaldson Cave Nature Preserve. And we have some critters that live in that cave and other caves in Indiana that are known only in Indiana caves. And the occurrence in Indiana has actually made southern Indiana a hot spot with regard to really rare species. And if you look at this map and see that where it's really red, that's where there's high levels of very rare species. And most often they're endemic species, meaning they occur nowhere else. But here we are up in Indiana. We're a hot spot. And look at all, those are mostly in the Appalachian Mountains. And then you get down into Florida. So I think that's something that we can take some satisfaction and pride in. Wind Cave National Park out in South Dakota. We don't have big, massive, expansive grasslands in Indiana. We used to in northwest Indiana where there was prairie. But we have some little small remnants of grasslands in southern Indiana. We call them limestone glades, or sometimes called limestone barrens, where it's so rocky that trees won't grow well, and they're commonly populated with prairie plants, the ones that you'd more likely expect to find further west in the prairie. And on the east, right side of the picture there is a nature preserve, Teeple Glade Nature Preserve. And one of my favorite plants that you can expect to see there is a native agave. You don't have to go to the southwest to see native agaves. In fact, they even grow in some really dry sites here in southwest Indiana, but mostly in the hill country in south central Indiana. It's our native agave. And looks, especially the leaves of it, the basal rosette of leaves look like some of the agaves you'd expect to see out west. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention at least one native orchid. We have 45 native species of orchids in Indiana. They're true orchids, not similar orchids. They are true native orchids and grow in some of the most interesting habitats. And this one is most interesting to me because it's able to tolerate that really dry, rocky soil in which you often find in glades or around glades. And there is one called the crested coral root. Notice you don't see any green leaves. That's because it derives its nutrition from fungi that in turn derive its nutrition from a green plant. So in an indirect sense, it's a parasite. It cannot make its own food. It has no green leaves, no capability of photosynthesis, ever. So it has to get its energy from somewhere. In reality, this plant's subterranean. It lives and can live probably decades if it so choose, but it will only come above ground to flower. And you can find it in flower and then maybe go back and might not see it for years perhaps again. So it stands about, it can get 2 feet in height or so, maybe even a little bit more, but a beautiful orchid, I think. This is a barren site where, again, it's often very rocky and dry and with low nutrient soils. And it can have scrubby oaks like post oak and blackjack oak and a lot of different prairie species. And this is a site in the Hoosier National Forest in a big part of their property called Mogan Ridge. And a fascinating place, and it has some fascinating animals. This is a little cicada. I happen to like all that sound that a cicada makes, even when the periodical cicadas come, and there are millions of them. I seek them out because I just love to hear them. It makes it sound like I've got tinnitus, which I do, so I'm in harmony with them. But I do, seriously, my wife can tell you, I just love them. But these I cannot hear anymore because it's not very loud and it's kind of high-pitched. But they're tiny little things, and instead of living in trees, they live in grasslands. And they're not very common in Indiana because this area in Clover Leaf Barrens is one of the few areas that's large enough that can support these little things. They can also support this. What's that look like? Looks like a tarantula, doesn't it? Almost. Well, that is pretty scary looking, but it's no bigger than that. And that happens to be my hand. But I didn't pick it up. There was another person that was brave enough. He's an entomologist. That's what his real profession is, but you might say he's also an arachnologist. But he picked it up without hesitation. And he'd never even seen it before. But I could verge on stupidity. But anyway, I figured if he lets it crawl on him, I'm going to let it crawl on me. And so I got a picture of it. It's a pretty cool spider, but apparently they're not very common in Indiana. Okay, and now the southwest, the part where we're now sitting. Fabulous part of the state. I don't know if you know this gentleman, but he lived in southwest Indiana for a while back in the 1800s and ended up moving over to Illinois along the Wabash, but he's pretty much been living close to the Wabash River his life. And he talked about these huge trees that could be found in the bottoms along the Wabash. And well, maybe not as big as the sequoia out in Sequoia National Park. And you probably can't find any of that tree that big anymore in Indiana. But anyone guess what that tree is? I bet you've seen that picture before maybe. Sycamore. Yeah, that by far was the largest tree that ever occurred in Indiana. And I found a report from growing in the bottoms in southern Harrison County that I believe to be accurate, because they talk about measuring it, had several people several times measuring it. Of course, this was back in the 1800s. 22 feet in diameter. And I don't mean circumference, I mean in diameter. So that was a huge tree. And that one's a pretty good size one, but reports of 13 to 15 feet diameter sycamores, not uncommon in the early literature. If you're so fortunate, you might find this beautiful plant. This is the spider lily. Have you ever seen that? And it's no one's seen this plant in the wild? Oh man, you need to go, you need to go. Twin Swamps Nature Preserve, which we'll be talking about in a minute, has some of this, not a lot of it. I'm afraid some people might be digging up. Don't do that. But this plant will stand, a good 2 to 3 feet, maybe 3 is probably pushing it. Big flowers, big as your hand, I would say. Has these spidery-like segments that come down, hence the name spider lily. Down at, I think, probably Lincoln State Park, you might be able to find some in the lowlands there. There's a nature preserve down in that part of the world too, along Pigeon Creek and Little Pigeon Creek. You could find perhaps some of these. Bloomfield Barrens or Bloomfield Bottoms is one area where you might see this. And that's this range. You see it's a real southerner, and it just barely gets up into Indiana. And this extremely rare plant, with us at least, not so much farther south, is called pinkroot. And just an amazingly colorful plant. And you could also see this in some places, even along a few roadsides near Twin Swamps Nature Preserve, down in the southwest part of the corner of Posey County. Now, this is very near to home for some of you if you live in Jasper. This is an old map. It's 1946. And it's a topographic map, and you can see the town of Jasper there at the bottom. And then this big open flat land just to the northeast of it. That map refers to it as Buffalo Flat. It used to be actually a body of water, and even older maps and records refer to it as Buffalo Pond. Now, it's not too far from the Buffalo Trace, which is just north of this that you see on the map above it. And perhaps it was named because the bison like to go down there. I don't know that anyone really knows. But a portion of it today is a state-dedicated nature preserve. And most people wouldn't even think about going in it. You know, it's a swamp. And there's no boardwalk or trail into it. But of course, I'm a swamp advocate. You know, they're so important and they're so rich in diversity. And I'll tell you, it may be, if not for that, Jasper might get flooded a little more than it is, because that contains quite a bit of water during flood periods. But anyway, it's a neat place. Here's a little bit closer view of it, showing how extensive it once was. There's some ditches in it now, actually, so it's not as big as it was. But this is what it looks like if you were to ever venture in. It's a pretty neat place. The water, at least it gives it a chance to calm down. It's clear, not too deep, and lots of interesting plants. That's arrow arum that's growing there. It's not the arrow leaf like a lot. It's so very common. This is actually a relative of jack-in-the-pulpit, green dragon, skunk cabbage. It's a really tropical looking thing. And you could come across this, which is a really showy plant called the American snowball. There are not many of them in there, but it's an attractive shrub and not very common even within the state of Indiana. I pulled this slide from a talk I'd given some years ago called The Lost Grassland. And you might think, well, we're talking about prairie, but no, we're talking about cane, giant cane or bamboo. It's our native bamboo. And I suspect you've seen this maybe if you've driven. About the only place where it's left that you can see much of it is along roadsides or in ditches. But it used to be so much more extensive. Now it is a grass, it's a woody grass, and it's a cane pole. You know, you can go fishing with this thing. Although our our cane maybe doesn't get big enough to make much of a cane pole, but anyway, it's a really interesting native bamboo, if you will. There you can kind of see on the right, has those nodes, and it is, like I say, a woody grass. Now, you know old John James Audubon, he lived in Henderson, Kentucky, right across from very near Evansville, and he was there for 10 years, and he traveled around, you know, from when he lived in Henderson as well, and came across the river into Indiana, right at one of the big bends of the Ohio River, but in Indiana. And he talks about a portion of ground thus covered with canes is called a cane break. And that's where you just got this extensive growth of cane. And that's what it might have looked like, but I suspect even thicker. But this is a bottomland forest with a little bit of cane. But it's almost all gone now. So what I did was I took some notes from the original land survey, and if you're not familiar with those were done mostly prior to settlement of the state, and they marked every square mile of land in the state and described the vegetation that grew along that line and where the lines intersected. So you know you have all these east-west lines and all these north-south lines, and it's the same survey system upon which we measure land today. If you have a piece of property, it's going to be based upon what they did back in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And what you see there that's red are these extensive cane breaks that they mapped along the Ohio River that no longer exist. They're all in agriculture currently. Here is one that I mapped that's directly across from Henderson, Kentucky. That's the red you see in the lower right. That's the town. And all that in yellow is one giant cane break as determined by what the early surveyors said when they did it back in the early 1800s, see 1805. And those are some of the notes that they made. Rich land and plenty of cane. Covered with cane, the ponds accepted. Land level and rich. Timber, cane, walnut, ash, and sugar. And that was over 8,000 acres, but none of that exists today. It's agriculture. So that's what I meant by a lost grassland. There are really no community level expanses of this plant that used to occur here. And for me, I've saved the best for last because this is one of my very favorite places. Yes, the Everglades is one of my favorite places, but in Indiana, it's a place we call Twin Swamps Nature Preserve. And you don't need to raise your hands unless you want to, but I'd like to think that you've all been there, or if you haven't, you need to go, because there's nothing really approachable as this is in Indiana of a naturally occurring cypress swamp, because there's a trail and a boardwalk that will take you out amongst those cypress trees. And it's at the very toe of southwest Posey County. If you drive south of Mount Vernon, Indiana, and then head down towards Hovey Lake, and it's not too far, it's a mile or so from Hovey Lake. But I believe it's the highest quality bald cypress swamp that we have in Indiana. And there you can see the distribution. We are at least in the Midwest, up in Knox County, the northernmost natural occurrence of bald cypress in the Midwest, and almost in the world, except you can see in the far upper right there, just by a few miles latitudinally, in Delaware of all places, there are naturally occurring bald cypress swamps. Notice the growths you're probably familiar with, what are called cypress knees down here that come up out of the water. Those are attached to the roots of the cypress trees. And then, of course, the cypress have those distinctive swollen bases to them. And if I just can't say enough about going there. A little side note I'll tell about me personally. When I proposed to my wife, this was in southern Illinois, and there's some really nice cypress swamps there. And I had spent a lot of time in them. I'd waded out in them. I worked in them. And I said, I want to get married in a swamp. Well, guess what? She wouldn't do it. But she did the next best thing. So a few years ago, I don't know how many it's been now, maybe even 10, she wanted to go to New Harmony because it's a neat little town. And she knew the nature preserve because she wanted to go see Twin Swamps because there are a lot of salamanders there, which I'll show you a few in a second. But she really likes salamanders. And she says, oh, let's go there. I said, okay. And we arrive in the parking lot, and there are a couple of cars, which is not uncommon, but a lot of times there aren't any because it's a tiny little lot, and this is out in the middle of nowhere. And we're walking, and I hear some people up ahead on the boardwalk, and I say, Barb, I think there must be a class here because I've never known so many people that come to this place. It must be a class. So, okay, so we go and get closer, and I said, and I could see some people in the distance, and there was, I don't know, 20 people. And I said, that looks like somebody we know. And I looked again, and it was a neighbor of ours from the town where we live, outside Indianapolis. And I thought, this is wild. I didn't know that he would be interested in this place ever. And we get closer, and it's a bunch of family and friends. And what she told me was, she surprised me. I had no idea. She said, we're getting in the swamp. And so we did. And we had our vows from our original wedding said, and we exchanged them there. So we did get married in a swamp. So where is she? Stand up, Barbara. Oh, she's running. She's hidden. Nope, she's here. There she is. So you can congratulate her for having the will to do that and actually get in the swamp this time. We literally got in it. So there it is, Twin Swamps Nature Preserve. There's the boardwalk. In fact, there's a brand new boardwalk there now. And oh my, the salamanders. If you love salamanders, that's a good place to go. Those are spotted salamanders on the right, and on the left there's a marbled salamander. Just beautiful little salamanders. And this is an extremely rare one, known only from Twin Swamps. That's called the mole salamander, a little old thing. It's a deeply southern species that just, again, another one of those things that get barely into Indiana. It's kind of homely looking, I guess, compared to those other ones, but it's cute nonetheless, right? I call her the salamander whisperer. She really loves those salamanders. We call it Twin Swamps, by the way, because they're two linear swamps parallel to one another. One's dominated by ball cypress, and the other one used to be dominated by overcup oak, which is another southern species, but beaver have flooded it over the decades, and it pretty much killed out most of them. So now it's mostly a buttonbush swamp. Here's a rare fern that you can find there. I think I mentioned during the hike today that ferns come in all shapes and sizes. And this is one right here. Can you find it? It's right there. And if you know all these other little floating things, that's duckweed. So this whole fern here is maybe a ½ an inch across, but it floats, and it is a true fern. It's called mosquito fern. It doesn't attract mosquitoes, by the way, don't worry. There it is. And there you can get a little idea of the scale of the thing. Isn't that a cutie? And another interesting plant of the swamp is this called featherfoil. Notice it says Homoya inflata. Well, the featherfoil refers to the feather-like leaves that are submerged, and the inflata part of the Homoya inflata name is those bobber-like hollow stems which keep the plant afloat, and that's how it disperses seed. You can see the little flowers there in the upper portions of those tubes, and then the plant detaches from the bottom and floats around in the swamp, and ultimately will die down and disperse the seeds into the water. Pretty clever way to get around. But another common or an uncommon plant in Indiana. And I'm going to end it there. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Or, well, thank you. If there's time, I mean, I'll be afterwards. I could.
If you want to take a few questions, and then we'll do the door prizes after.
Okay.
Are there any questions?
I'm just going to grab a little swig of water here, please. Excuse me. Yes.
Is there a best time of the year to get the most awesome experience at Twin Swamps?
Yeah, I personally would probably go, excuse me, best time to go to Twin Swamps to me would be end of April and early May. A lot of the migrating birds have come in by then, and some really interesting ones that like to live in that swamp, prothonotary warblers and you know, you name it, there's all kinds of little things, but that's one you often hear a lot in there. And it's starting to green up. There's not a lot of wildflowers. This is not a place to go like we did today and saw just gobs of flowering plants. They're a little farther and fewer between there. There's some interesting ones like that spider lily, but so in the spring they're not big displays. There are some, don't get me wrong, but it's usually the weather's the nicest then. You know, in the middle of the summer you get that big river mood that kind of goes on there. It's sultry. You know, the air is thick with that humidity. You're in the lowest part of the state, and if you're not accustomed to sweating, you might not want to go. But surprisingly, I have rarely ever encountered seriously thick swarms of mosquitoes. An occasional, seriously, I think maybe the fish and the larvae of the salamanders and frogs that are in there and the duckweed kind of help keep that down. I mean, some people, if there's 2 mosquitoes, there are too many, right? Maybe 1, but you're not going to get, at least I never have, swarmed with them and say, that's it, I've got to get out of here. But I'd probably go early May, I think would be my choice. Okay? Yes.
I have a question. It's about changing climate. We have so many of those little plants, or the plants that are in these little pockets here and there. What will happen to those as the climate changes?
Well, it depends on the species, I suspect. Some of them are in microclimates that are perhaps a little more moist and cool in temperature than the general outside ambient air. It's hard to say. Some of them are going to like it probably. I mean, some of those are growing naturally in hot, dry environments. But it's really kind of unpredictable. So far, I haven't noticed any of them dropping out in my term, at least. The greater threat, as always, is habitat alteration, habitat changes, or just outright destruction. We've lost just so much of our native flora and fauna that way. But yeah, I can't predict it. It would be hard to say. Yes, sir.
Is there a best time or place to try to see crested coral root orchids? You said they're very hard to catch flowering.
Yeah. Sometimes they seem to be fickle. Some years you'll find them seeming, not everywhere, but in a number of places. Other years you can't hardly buy one. There is, oddly, interestingly enough, a place along a roadside in Clark State Forest, but I don't know, that's not the true experience to me. You need to find it in a real rocky, dry, desert-like glade area. And the one place I will mention, there's a nature preserve in Harrison Crawford State Forest called Post Oak Cedar Nature Preserve. And I've seen in certain years quite a few plants there, but there's never that guarantee that you can go and find them. But yeah.
Midsummer-ish?
Yeah, it's usually late July, early August. So that's another hot time. Well, it's been such a pleasure to be with you all. I'm glad that you allow me to come here, and I appreciate you taking your time for coming. So thank you very much.